Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this week's Parsha discussion. This week we'll be discussing Parsha Mikeitz, um, and we do the weekly Parsha discussion every Sunday at noon Pacific Standard Time, and we also do the morning prayers, the shacharit prayers, Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So as I said, this week's Parsha is going to be Mikeitz, and we're going to be taking a look at Yosef becoming the overseer of Egypt, appointed by the Pharaoh because of his interpretations of the Pharaoh's dreams, and also take a look at his reunification with his brothers and the couple of encounters that they have. So the first thing I'd like to do is give to tzedakah. And then we'll recite the blessings of the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'ha'arev na Adonai Eloheinu, et divrei Toratecha, b'finu u'fi amcha beit Yisrael. V'niyech anachnu, v'tzetzeinu, v'tzetzei amcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha, v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai, hamlamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu, asher baharbanu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai, notein ha'torah. Amen. Okay, so as I said, we start out the Parsha of Mikeitz with Yosef being released from jail and interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams. And so Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. The first dream that he has, and we'll see this duality throughout the Parsha. There seems to be this duality, things happening twice. Pharaoh has two dreams. Yosef meets with his brothers twice. It seems like this is a very full Parsha, and part of that is that there seems to be a lot of repetition, and we'll kind of take a look at that. But anyways, back to Pharaoh's dream. So Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. The first one being that he has a dream of 7 cows, and they're all healthy and robust, and then 7 additional cows come that are not healthy. It says that they're ugly of appearance, and those cows devour the first cows. So that's the first dream, and then he has a second dream, this time with 7 ears of stock with 7 ears of grain on it that are again healthy and looking good. And then 7 more ears that devour the first ears, and very similar to the first dream that he had. This time, instead of cows, you have the ears of grain. And so Pharaoh goes to his advisors and tries to make some interpretation of these dreams. And there's some discussion as to whether his advisors are unable to interpret the dreams, or if they are able to interpret the dreams, but Pharaoh is not happy with their interpretations of the dreams. But that's not the important part. The important part is that the cupbearer who was imprisoned with Yosef is released and returns to Pharaoh's service and forgets to tell Pharaoh that Yosef had interpreted his dreams. And then 2 years later, upon hearing about these dreams that Pharaoh is having, the cupbearer says, "Oh, wait a minute! There was someone that I was imprisoned with that is able to interpret dreams. He interpreted my dreams and the dreams of the baker, and they all came true." So so Joseph is released and interprets Pharaoh's dreams. And so taking a look at these dreams, I think one thing that's important to look at is the difference between the different dreams that different characters have. And one of the things that we know very early on, actually the very first verse, it says, "It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh was dreaming, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. And from the Nile were coming up 7 cows." And so when we compare this with dreams that others have had, specifically Yaakov, we'll use as an example. In Pharaoh's dream, he's standing over the Nile, standing over the cows, standing over everything. And it gives this idea that the ultimate presence or being is Pharaoh, standing over everything, whether it's nature with the Nile or the cows. And especially with the Nile, we see the cows coming up from the Nile. And the idea of this is that the Nile was treated as a deity in and of itself. It provided life, it provided sustenance for the Jewish people. Obviously, the cows come up from the Nile. Everything's kind of dependent on the Nile. And the idea that the Pharaoh is above the Nile is saying that if the Nile is a deity, Pharaoh is above that. Whereas when we look at someone like Yaakov had a dream where it clearly states that Hashem stood over him. So we see that the Jewish people in their dreams or their prophetic visions, they are not seen as the ultimate entity in this world. And we'll come up to it a little bit later, but even Joseph's dreams with his brothers in the previous Parsha, he's toiling in the field. They're working and they're binding sheaves of grain. And so there's almost this kind of entitlement to Pharaoh's dreams that Joseph, he was working his dreams. He didn't have that sense of entitlement. We'll come back around to that. So this idea of Pharaoh standing over the river, it's something that Midrash Rabbah states and takes a look at, this idea that he's overseeing everything. And so we continue on, and we get to the part where the cupbearer says, "Hey, there was someone that was imprisoned with me that can help." So the cupbearer starts out by saying to Pharaoh, I call to mind my faults today. So it's an interesting part where the cupbearer says, I did something wrong. I'm going to admit to it. But at the same time, there's kind of this glossing over or, just kind of making what he did wrong not that bad. And so as we continue, the cupbearer describes, what Joseph had done, and then he goes on to describe Joseph, and Rashi comments on this, that Joseph is painted still in a negative light, and that there's no kindness that's done entirely, fully. It's a half kindness that the cupbearer does. So he says in verse 12, "And there was with us a Hebrew lad, a slave of the chief slaughterer, and he interpreted our dreams for us, for each of us. He interpreted according to his dream." And so this idea of how he's describing Joseph, Rashi commented, he's really painted in a negative light. So it's interesting that he says, what I've done wrong. I forgot to do this, but here was this poor slave that was in prison that really isn't worth that much. And so it just kind of calls into the idea that although he's doing a kindness, first of all, he forgot for 2 years, leaving Joseph in prison. And then on top of that, really not describing him or painting him in the best light. So then we continue, and we'll come back to the dreams that Pharaoh has. And so if we look at verses 17 and 18, again, we like I said, there's a lot in this parsha that kind of doubles and repeats itself. And so again, we hear about the dream that Pharaoh was standing over the Nile, and the 7 cows that were healthy came, and then there were 7 cows after them that were not healthy. So we go through that again. And again, like I said, it's interesting to note that Pharaoh is standing by the Nile, having no influence over it, overseeing it, but isn't taking an active role in the course of the Nile or the cattle, or even when he mentions the grain that's growing. Pharaoh doesn't have an active role in that. It's almost as if life happens and Pharaoh is a bystander. And this is an important kind of foreshadowing. And so we take a look at, what does Pharaoh actually control? What does he have power over? And I think that this is the first instance that we really see that the Pharaoh doesn't have any control or power, even though he claims and says, I'm the highest in the land. He doesn't really have any effect on anything. And it's interesting to note this because it harkens me back to the story of Passover, which we'll come to, soon. But a part that really stands out for me is this idea that Hashem hardened Pharaoh's heart. Specifically, doesn't say that Pharaoh had a hard heart, or that he was this person that couldn't be persuaded or changed, and he was just evil. And it's interesting that he's not the one that hardened his heart. Hashem is. So we take a look at Pharaoh and we question what is it that Pharaoh actually does, or is he just a bystander? Whereas in comparison, we have Joseph's dream that he's in the field, he's toiling, he's working with the grain with his brothers and binding sheaves. They're active participants. Joseph's an active participant in life. He affects the change. He makes things happen. So one of the first thoughts is, what is a person's focus? Are we focusing on the small things that we can do and putting all the work that we can into these small things? Or are we like Pharaoh, where we've got these massive things like the Nile that provide sustenance and feed his people, and just stand back and say, yes, I'm in control of that, but really have no effect on it? And it's an important message to focus on the things that you can affect change, focus on the things that you can work towards and provide. I would make the argument that Joseph provides sustenance for himself and those around him a lot more than Pharaoh does. And so really what this comes down to is the things that are important to you, you have to put effort into. And I'll give a little analogy, a story from my childhood. So when I was when I was a teenager, I was given a car. And it was a beautiful car, very nice car. And it was just given to me and said, here you go, here's your car. And I drove that car for a few years. It was brand new when I got it. And I really drove that car into the ground. I didn't appreciate it very much. I was proud of the fact that I had that car, but I didn't really appreciate it. And I didn't put any work into it. I didn't put any effort into it. I drove it and it ran out of oil. And I continued to drive it, and I probably drove it tens of thousands of miles more, never servicing it or taking care of it. And what ended up happening is the engine was destroyed, the car was no longer usable, and not only was the car gone at that point, but all the benefit that I derived from it, because I didn't put anything into it. Nowadays, I have a car and I put a lot of work into it. I give it a lot of attention, always service it. I'm always working on it. And it's through that toil and that effort that I continue to ensure that I will receive the benefits from it. I make sure that it'll last for years and years to come and I can continue driving it. And I think it's important to look at all the different things in life that we have an impact on and an effect, and what do we put effort into, and what do we seek for ourselves. And it's also interesting to note that we're not always doing things because we're seeking some reward or payoff. That's almost like a secondary side effect. Our role, our path, our way is to put our energy and effort into something. And as a result, as a side effect, we'll see that we're receiving rewards from that. But really, it's the effort and the energy that we're putting in, toiling, that is really defining our course in life and gives our life meaning. So that's just a little example from my life. And so we'll continue on, and so if we continue on, Joseph again interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh appoints Joseph to be the overseer of his lands and making the decisions. And again, this is yet another example where we see the Pharaoh is a bystander standing back, reaping all the benefits, but really not putting any effort into it. He said, Joseph, you take care of all my lands. You have interpreted my dreams to say that there will be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So go and take care of it. And everybody in the land will do what you say. So again, he's taking that passive role. And so we continue, and Joseph makes the plans to ensure the well-being of the people, and tells the people that, hey, you need to start storing your grains and your resources, store those so that after the 7 years of plenty are up and there's 7 years of famine, you will still have something to survive off of. And so that's what Joseph does, and the famine comes, people are struggling, and then we're reintroduced to Joseph's brothers. And we come to the point where Yaakov sees that there's grain being sold in Egypt. Egypt has grain that's to be had. There isn't grain in the land of Canaan. So it's time to send his sons to Egypt to get grain. And it's really interesting that he has all of his sons go, but not Joseph's brother Benjamin. And if we look at chapter 42, verse 4, it says, "But Joseph's brother Benjamin, Jacob did not send with his brothers, because he said, lest misfortune befall him." This is a really interesting part where we start to see Yaakov's ideas about the road and travels and journeys. He definitely expresses this concern for them. And we even see this in the previous parsha, where it mentions that it was the land where Yitzhak sojourned and Yaakov dwelt. Yaakov is not a sojourner. He's not on a journey. He has peace for himself when he's in the land where he dwells. That's his place. That's his safe spot, and that's where he stays. And we see all the things that have happened to Yaakov in his travels, when he is on the road, when he's out sojourning. We see a number of things happen. First of all, Yaakov's wife died on the road and was buried on the road. Joseph was on the road and never returned. Even going forward, Shimon is arrested and doesn't return. So Yaakov has this idea that being on the road and traveling and journeying is fraught with peril, and bad things happen. And so he asks that Benjamin stay behind and not go. So why does he ask this? Why this brother? Why Benjamin? Why not the others? Well, as I just said, his wife died on the road. Yosef never returned. Benjamin is, in a sense, the last of that line from that wife. And I think that, Yaakov sees the import of that and asks that Benjamin stay behind. So that's kind of some of the ideas behind Benjamin staying and kind of encapsulating where Yaakov is coming from. So then we continue on a couple verses, and we see in verse 6, we'll just read that really quickly. It says, "Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. It was he who sold grain to the entire populace of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and prostrated themselves to him with their faces to the ground." And so we read this, and we remember from the previous parshas that Yaakov was in mourning for his son Joseph, and was very distraught by his absence and his disappearance. And we think, okay, so now Joseph has all this power. He's the ruler over the land. Why did he not send word to Yaakov and say, "Hey, I'm still alive. I'm still here. You no longer need to mourn"? And so, one of the ideas that's put forth by this is the order by which Yosef is to fulfill the dreams that he had. Nachmanides talks about this, in that in Yosef's first dreams, he was dreaming that he and his brothers were toiling in the field and binding sheaves, and it was he and his brothers. Then he has a second dream where it's the heavenly bodies and everyone bowing to him. And so Nachmanides explains that this is kind of the progression that Yosef understood needed to be followed. He couldn't first go to his father and say, "Hey, I'm still alive," without fulfilling the first dream of his brothers bowing to him. And this is something that we discussed in the previous week's Parsha. So first he needed to fulfill the idea that his brothers would bow to him. Then after that come the heavenly bodies, and at that point he can address his father. So he knew that he needed to have reconciliation with his brothers first before he could take any other steps. And perhaps maybe the idea behind this is that, as we discussed last week, if Yaakov knew that Yosef was still alive, he could send for him, he could go home, and perhaps there wouldn't even be a Jewish people if Yosef just went and returned home, and that would be the end of it. I think that to a degree he understood that and knew that was important, but he was given these visions to kind of guide him towards his future. And so that's what he did. He first attempted the reconciliation with his brothers. And so we'll get to it in a little bit, but this is also why the last brother, Benjamin, had to be present. He wasn't sent on the first journey to Egypt, and the brothers return and say, "Okay, well, we need to bring Benjamin with us. We need to go back first because, as I said, Yosef needed to have all of his brothers to fulfill that prophecy in his first dream." So Then we continue on, and so the brothers they go to Egypt, and then they return back home and explain to Yaakov what had happened. And so this is really important what they say as a step to start seeing the transformation in the brothers. So it says in chapter 42, verse 21, and they said to one another, indeed, we are guilty for our brother, that we witnessed the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this trouble has come upon us. And it's interesting to note in this passage that the brothers don't express a regret or any repentance for the idea that they threw Yosef in a pit. There wasn't any remorse for selling Yosef as a slave. No, what they point out is that they're guilty, that they witnessed the distress of his soul, and we did not listen. And so this is an important thing to look at, because what they're calling attention to is really what's the more meaningful or more important sin that they committed. And there's even discussion that the throwing him in the pit and selling him was perhaps maybe not even the wrong thing to do. But the fact that he called out and that he was in distress and they witnessed it and did nothing, that was the greatest sin. And it speaks to us in all of our lives. You know, what's important for us? Is it important that we live a righteous life, that we live the right way? Or is it more important that we reach out to others who need help? And when we see someone in distress and someone that's reaching out, that they're not just ignored. Really, there isn't a lot of discussion as to what we do about it when someone is in distress. But we very first need to heed it and acknowledge that it goes on. And we'll see this come up in the coming Parshas. One of the really important ideas is that we have been fortunate and blessed in the outcomes of our experiences, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore the tribulations and the distress that other people are in. And this is especially important in the story of the Exodus. The Jews are saved and delivered from Egypt, but it's not something that we overly celebrate. We appreciate it. We're thankful for it, but that came through a lot of pain and a lot of suffering, and it's important for us to acknowledge that what the Egyptians went through and what they experienced. That's something that we need to acknowledge. So the entire idea of Pesach is not just celebrating, yay, hooray, we survived and the Egyptians were decimated. That's not the idea. The idea is that we're thankful that we were delivered from the hands of our slave masters and received freedom, but we also acknowledge, and in a very somber sense, mourn and address what had happened to the Egyptian people. At one point, Hashem even says to the angels, "This is not a time to sing." He's destroying his own creations, as everything in existence was created by Hashem. And with this destruction, that's not the time to sing. That's not the time to celebrate and be joyous. It's a time to be thankful, but be humble and realize and recognize the distress that others are in. And this portion really calls to that, where the brothers start to notice that really that's the greatest sin. Not selling Yosef, not throwing him in a pit, but not acknowledging when someone else is in distress. So we'll continue on. So the brothers go to see Joseph, and they meet with him, and they get grain from Joseph. I mentioned Shimon needs to stay imprisoned until they return with Benjamin, but their bags are filled with grain, and then inside their bags is all the money that they had spent for the grain. It's returned to them. So we take a look at that verse, and that is verse 35. Where it says, "And it came to pass that they were emptying their sacks, and behold, each one's bundle of money was in his sack. They saw the bundles of their money, they and their father, and they became frightened." So why did they become frightened? They weren't celebrating that, hey, they got all this grain and they got all their money back. They were frightened. And it's interesting. It's almost like they didn't know how to respond to that. Should they be thinking, is that almost like, quote unquote, your money's no good here? Why are we getting our money back? We're really afraid of what the outcome might be. And so we can interpret this passage that this could be Joseph's kind of test of character. I mean, when we look back at the previous Parsha, what does he know of his brothers? He knows that they threw him in a pit, and he knows that they sold him. And here they are prostrating themselves before him. What is their real character? What happens if I give them their grain and I put the money in their sacks and send them home? Do they celebrate and rejoice at their good fortune? Or do they have fear and say, hey, this is not right. Something wrong is going on here, and we need to address that and figure out what's going on and make it right. So it's an interesting kind of first step that Joseph embarks on in determining, what is the story of his brother's character now? Because he's been gone for a long time, and people change. And so that's something important for us to realize, that we should continue to give people opportunities despite what they've done wrong. We should always try and search for that light and that transformation that a person has undergone to make themselves better. For each and every one of us, we drive to be a better person and to make ourselves better, and we should allow that for other people too. We shouldn't deny those around us the opportunity to improve and be better as well. And so this is kind of Joseph's opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to test them. I'm going to make something wrong in their life and see what they do with it. Do they take the right path or do they not? So we continue on, and Yaakov is talking with his sons about the events that happened, and they said, well, we need to go back, but we need to go back with Benjamin. We need to bring him with us. And so we continue on to chapter 43, where we've got the two promises from the two brothers to Yaakov. First, we have the promise from Reuben that if Benjamin goes, and this was in the first journey, if he goes, I'll look after him and take care of him and make sure that harm doesn't come to him. So then we come back, and then we have Yehuda's promise. And what does Yehuda say? He says in verse 11, so Yisrael, their father, said to them, if so, then do this. Take some of the choice products of the land in your vessels. Take down a gift, balm and honey, wax and lotus, pistachios and almonds. And take double the money in your hands, and take your brother and go back. So, why is it that the Yaakov accepts Yehuda's promise and does not accept Reuben's promise? And the reason why this is because of what the two staked on the success of ensuring Benjamin's safety. In Reuben's case, there really wasn't anything at stake for himself. What he said was, I'll make sure that nothing happens to him. And we see even through Torah that when having to make a decision between what's best for yourself or taking care of someone else, you have to make sure that you take care of yourself. Otherwise, you won't be there to take care of someone else. And that's really where this comes from, is Yehuda's promise that he and his generations that follow will be sacrificed if anything happens to Benjamin. They're the ones that will bear the brunt of it. And so through that way, it's not just saying, I promise I'll take care of Benjamin. It's saying that I need to take care of Benjamin because if I don't, something will happen to me. And that drive for self-preservation is really what made the difference for Yaakov to finally acquiesce. You may think to yourself, well, that's kind of interesting because it seems kind of self-centered. Just take care of yourself, and that's the way to do things. But we also can't deny our own innate drive to make sure that we are in a good place and that we're taking care of our needs. And there's a couple reasons for that. First, as I said, if you're not in the best place for yourself, how can you take care of other people? But even more importantly, when we talked a few parshas back about the difference between the animal soul and the divine soul, and if the path is to serve Hashem, you can't do that if you're harmed. And so there's two aspects. Are you looking out for yourself because you're selfish and self-centered and fulfilling the needs of the animal soul? Or are you fulfilling the needs of the divine soul and saying, I need to look out for myself because if I look out for myself, I can better serve Hashem? And so the first inclination is to say, well, that's kind of self-centered, but through thorough examination, we see that just because you're looking out for yourself doesn't mean that you're necessarily self-centered. And so Yehuda's promise is accepted, and it's a significant one that changes Yaakov's mind and says, okay, in this instance, you can take Benjamin and you will look out for him. And so they return with Benjamin, and again they fill their sacks, and Yosef has the head of his house put the silver goblet into Benjamin's in an effort to frame him and kind of set him up and say Benjamin is going to get caught. He puts the goblet in his bag, sends the brothers on their way, and then again sends his head of the household after the brothers, knowing that Benjamin will be caught with the goblet among his possessions. And so we again revisit this idea: why was he framed? What is the reason for that? He says it says in chapter 44, verse 2, in my goblet, the silver goblet, put into the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his purchase money. And he did according to Joseph's words, which he had spoken. So Joseph is the one that organized all of this. Why Benjamin? Again, this was an opportunity to put his brothers through a situation and see how they've transformed, see how they have changed. In the previous parsha, we saw that Yosef was the favored by Yaakov, and his brothers again took him, threw him into a pit, and then sold him to traders. And so now he's saying, I'm going to put my brothers in the same situation. And let's see if they do something differently, if they've transformed the way they do things or how they behave. What will their reaction be now? And so he does this, and the servant is sent after them, catches them, and obviously Benjamin has the goblet with him. This time the brothers don't abandon him. They don't say, well, he's the one that stole, take him, and we're scot-free. No. Again, they've transformed. They're different people from who they were. They're not the same brothers that threw Joseph into a pit and sold him. And again, Benjamin was now the favored son. We saw that in Yaakov's willingness to protect him and not even send him on this journey, the same way that Joseph was the favored. And the brothers had an opportunity to be envious or jealous. How have they transformed? First of all, they said they promised to keep Benjamin safe. Yehuda promises on his life and the life of his future generations to keep him safe. And when they are finally caught with the goblet, they still do not abandon Benjamin. And so we really start to see this transformation that's going to follow throughout the generations. As we discussed in the previous Parsha, we're now looking at the 12 tribes, the beginning of the 12 tribes. And we see that transformation take place. We see the change in who these brothers are and how they've changed in the years that Joseph has been in the land of Egypt. So that brings us to the end of the week's Parsha. And so what do we take away? What do we bring to our own lives that we can glean from this Parsha? First of all, as we just discussed, the allowing of the transformation of those around us. Just because someone errs or misdeeds doesn't mean that there's a blemish on their neshama for the rest of their life. There may be a scar, and those are things that we carry with us, but they're not things that we should say, oh, now because you have this scar, you will always have this wound, and you will always cause these bad things. You will be the effect of them. We need to allow the opportunity for people to grow and to become better, just as we continue to strive for that in our own lives. We would wish that for others as well. It's also important to take a look at the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams that Joseph made and understand what the significance is, not only for Pharaoh but for Joseph. What did he do because of those dreams? So what does Joseph do? He has everybody store grain and stores it within the city so that when the famine comes, there's something for them to go to. An analogy can be made with this, with the Jewish people being in exile. It's almost as if we're in famine. We're not in the best of times. And so what do we have stored up for us? What do we have to fall back on to get us through the famine, to get us through the lean times? Well, we have Torah. That's us taking what we can while we're in exile and storing and having something to fall back on, so that when we go through these hard times, there's something to sustain us and to get us through. And I think the final idea that we come to, and I'm sort of going through these backwards through the Parsha, but the final one that we come to is this idea, again, that we've explored in previous Parshas about a life of excess. And we mentioned previously the different patriarchs that did not have excess. They had what they needed. They had what they needed to satisfy the animal soul so that the divine soul can continue. And so in this Parsha, we really start to see an example, two examples side by side. Now we can look at Pharaoh and see what that life of excess looks like and what it leads to. And we see that in his dream where Pharaoh's standing over everything. But he's living life as a bystander. He's just taking and not putting anything in. Whereas Joseph in his dreams has the effort and the toil in the fields. And so the question is, do you make your own life? Do you have an effect on it? Do you reach out and get the things that you want? Do you pursue the things that are important to you? Or do you sit back and say, well, life will happen the way it's going to happen. I really have no impact on that, so it's just going to happen, and I'll stand back. It's kind of that idea of, does life happen to you, or do you happen to life? What active role are you taking there? And this is something that we should approach in every aspect. I previously gave the example of the vehicle, but there are different things throughout life that if we put energy and effort into, those things become all the more valuable, all the more meaningful. Where you live, do you put energy into that? Do you put energy into the upkeep of your home and keeping it clean and keeping things in repair? When you put that effort in, the home becomes more valuable. It doesn't become dilapidated, but also for your own well-being. It allows you to grow and focus on things that are important because you've taken care of those areas. And the same thing with a spouse. What effort, what energy are you putting in to your spouse? People will say, oh, we have a loving relationship. Well, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that you yourself love your wife or husband, or does that mean that you sit back and your husband or your wife loves you, or is it both? It's something where you need to put energy and effort into. You can sit back and say, oh, well, my spouse goes to work and works all day and brings in the money, and so we're well taken care of. Or my spouse does all the cooking and the cleaning and everything's taken care of, so I don't have to lift a hand or do any of that. And so what you're doing is you're the bystander in your own life. You're letting life happen as it happens without taking an active role. And so what we want to do is we want to put in the effort that we can put in, and in that way the reward is appreciated. It's taken care of, but it's also respected. And it's something where you say, I've had to work so long for this, and I've had to put so much in that the reward I get, I've really paid my dues for it. And that reward, as I said before, is almost a side effect or a secondary. Hey, this is what I put in, and I get all this back. And a nice aspect of that is that if you're putting the energy in, you're putting the effort in, that's where your focus is. That's where your intention and your energy is going. You really don't have time to sit back and say, oh, this is what I'm getting. You don't even have the opportunity to concern yourself of what am I getting out of this, because you're so focused on what you're putting into it. And so we can continue this with our religious adherence, and our belief in Hashem and being on the path. What do we put in there? Do we put in as much as we can? Or do we sit back and let life happen to us? Do we sit back and say, we're the Jewish people, we're the chosen ones, we don't need to do anything, we've got it made, we're set, we're holier than everybody else, and we're good? No, we don't do that. We continue to work, and we continue to strive, and we study and give to tzedakah, and regardless of what our status is, that's not the important part. The important part is what we are doing as individuals and as a community to help those around us? What are we putting into it? Are we making life? Are we shaping our home and our community and the greater world? Or are we just letting things go and let things happen? And I think that's really the biggest takeaway from this portion, is that we need to have an active role in our lives. We need to put effort and energy into things that are important. And that way we will have the lasting results, as opposed to a temporary result that is fleeting and that we don't really even care all that much about in the first place. So I wanted to thank you again for joining me, for taking a look at this week's Parsha. Again, we discuss the Parshas every week on Sunday at 12 o'clock noon Pacific Standard Time. You're also free to join us for the daily shacharit prayers that are at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And also, if you'd like to make any donations, you're welcome to donate to Patreon. There's a link in the description below, as well as on the channel homepage. So I want to thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful Hanukkah, and I hope you have a blessed rest of the day. Thank you.